Right now, there are nearly 8 billion people on Earth.
8 billion. But here's the thing. There almost weren't. Because the entire trajectory of human civilization was shaped by a single fact that nobody ever actually decided. Something that happened by accident. Over and over again for hundreds of thousands of years. For most of our species' existence, humans had children with almost no reliable way to control when or how often pregnancies happened. That single fact quietly shaped everything that followed. Wars, empires, religions, diseases, even the world you're living in right now. But what if it had been different? What if, somewhere in the Stone Age, some unusually clever hunter figured out that animal membrane or woven plant fiber could be used as reliable contraception? What if that idea spread from tribe to tribe until it became a normal part of everyday life? Would humanity have become more advanced? Or would civilization itself have unfolded in a completely different way? Let's find out. The first and most obvious consequence would be population growth, or the lack of it. For most of human history, people lived as hunter-gatherers. Small bands moved constantly, following animals, seasons, and edible plants. Birth rates stayed naturally low, partly because raising several young children while constantly traveling was brutally difficult. If reliable contraception had existed, that growth would have slowed even further. Now, here's where we have to be careful. Many archaeologists believe that growing populations were one of several pressures that pushed humans toward agriculture around 10,000 years ago, but not the only one. Climate shifts at the end of the last ice age and the sudden abundance of wild cereals in certain regions played a massive role too. So agriculture probably wouldn't disappear entirely, but it might have arrived far later or spread far more slowly. And that single delay could have changed everything downstream of it. With less pressure to feed growing numbers, humans may have stayed hunter-gatherers for thousands of additional years. Villages would still exist. Trade would still happen. But the enormous cities, the god kings, the empires that swallowed continents, those might have taken millennia longer to appear. That doesn't mean governments would never exist. Humans naturally organize themselves. But without massive agricultural surpluses to tax and control, power might have stayed smaller, more local, more scattered for a very, very long time. And that leads to something even stranger. The earliest known writing systems weren't invented to write poetry or philosophy. The archaeological record is pretty blunt about this. The first scripts we found were used to track taxes, grain stores, and trade debts. No sprawling states demanding records? Instead of each generation building on the last, some of what was learned would simply be lost over and over again forever. Or for entirely different reasons. Trade, religious ritual, navigation, storytelling passed down some other way. Writing probably wouldn't vanish from history. Its timeline would just shift. And that would ripple into something even bigger. Science. Humans don't need writing to innovate. Long before the first written symbol, our ancestors mastered fire, engineered sophisticated tools, and crossed entire oceans on rafts. Innovation wouldn't stop. But without written records, knowledge would spread painfully slowly. Instead of each generation building on the last, some of what was learned would simply be lost over and over again forever. Science wouldn't die. It would just crawl instead of run. Animal domestication tells a similar story. Dogs were almost certainly domesticated before agriculture even existed, so they'd probably still curl up by our fires either way. But cattle? Sheep? Goats? Horses? Those were deeply tangled up with farming societies and their surpluses. Without large agricultural communities pushing that process forward, domestication could have taken thousands of years longer. And that single change would have reshaped everything. Transportation, warfare, trade routes, the rise or non-rise of entire civilizations. No horses means no Mongol cavalry sweeping across Asia. No cattle-driven surplus means no easy leap into complex trade empires. Now here's something almost nobody thinks about: disease. Many sexually transmitted infections spread most efficiently through dense populations and long-distance trade networks. A reliable physical form of contraception could have genuinely slowed the spread of diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea, diseases that, in our real timeline, killed millions and altered the outcomes of wars. It wouldn't erase them, but it's not crazy to imagine millions of infections throughout history simply never happening. Many diseases have complicated origins, including jumps from animals, so contraception alone was never going to be a cure-all. Here's the cruel irony, though. The same slower population growth that prevents those diseases from spreading also delays the rise of the dense, complex civilizations that eventually invent microbiology, antibiotics, and vaccines. You dodge one disaster and, in doing so, postpone the very tools that would have solved it. Women's lives might look completely different, too. Throughout most of recorded history, a woman's social role was tied tightly to reproduction, often expected to bear as many children as her body could survive. Repeated pregnancy was dangerous, sometimes fatal, and it shaped what women were and weren't allowed to become. If reliable contraception had existed thousands of years earlier, women may have had real control over when or whether they had children. In some societies, that could have meant women becoming leaders, traders, or inventors far earlier than they did in our timeline. But let's not oversimplify this. Gender equality was never just about biology. Economics, law, religion, and culture all shaped and limited the status of women, often independently of reproduction. So the outcome would likely have varied wildly from one civilization to the next. Some societies might have shifted dramatically. Others might have found new reasons to restrict women anyway. Even the scientific revolution might have unfolded on a completely different timeline. It wasn't the work of one genius and a single flash of insight. It emerged from centuries of accumulated knowledge, funded by wealthy societies that could afford to support scholars, preserve books, and argue over ideas without needing everyone in the room to be farming or fighting. If civilization simply grew more slowly, that breakthrough might still come, but centuries or even millennia later than it did. So, would the world actually be better? At first glance, sure, it seems obvious. Less overpopulation, less strain on the planet, fewer unwanted pregnancies, possibly fewer epidemics, maybe even fewer wars. But history is almost never that simple. A huge amount of human innovation was born directly out of pressure. Scarcity forced better farming. Competition forced new technology. Crowded, filthy cities forced us to invent sanitation and modern medicine just to survive each other. Remove that pressure, and you might get a calmer relationship with nature, and a civilization that moves at a fraction of the speed. We'd probably still discover electricity eventually. We'd probably still build computers, still reach space. But eventually might mean thousands of years later than it actually happened. And that's the strange, uncomfortable truth about history. It almost never depends on one cause. Climate, geography, disease, culture, chance discoveries, and 1,000 small human choices are constantly colliding, branching off into countless possible futures. Would ancient condoms have changed history? Almost certainly. Would they have prevented civilization from happening at all? Probably not. They would have rewritten its timetable, stretched some chapters, erased others, written entirely new ones we can't even imagine. The modern world might still exist in this alternate timeline, but its pace, its priorities, and maybe even its values would be almost unrecognizable to us. History was never inevitable. It's the sum of countless small decisions, accidents, and unintended consequences echoing forward across thousands of years. Sometimes solving one problem just creates a new one further down the line. And sometimes the very obstacles we're afraid of today become the exact reason humanity invents something better tomorrow.
Thanks for watching.
If you enjoy exploring history's strangest what-if scenarios, don't forget to subscribe. There's plenty more waiting to be uncovered.